My name is Joanna Hobbs. I am 31 years old, and my morning started with a blatant act of theft right in my own driveway. I froze on the front steps, a surge of pure anger hitting me as I saw my older sister sitting comfortably in the driver's seat of my BMW. I marched straight to the door and slammed my knuckles against the glass, demanding she step out immediately. I reminded her sharply that this vehicle was my personal property, bought with my own hard-earned money, and absolutely no one was allowed to touch it without my permission. My sister slowly rolled down the window, her expression completely unapologetic and indifferent. "Get out of my car right now! Who gave you permission to take my keys?" I demanded, glaring at her. Before she could even answer, my mother, who was sitting in the back seat, immediately chimed in to defend this unacceptable behavior. "Stop complaining, Joanna," my mother stated coldly. "We need the car more than you do this morning. Just call an Uber to work." I barely had a second to process that absurd demand. My sister hit the gas. The engine revved aggressively, and the car sped out of the driveway, leaving me standing stranded and furious on the cold concrete. At that moment, I thought it was just another typical boundary violation. I had no idea that just 1 hour later I would receive a terrifying phone call from the police, revealing that my stolen car was involved in a severe hit and run, and the real culprits had planted my personal belongings at the crime scene to frame me for a felony. If you want to find out how I gathered the absolute proof to expose their malicious lies and ultimately sent my toxic relatives straight to prison, hit the subscribe button, leave a like, and follow this story to the very end. Standing on the cold concrete driveway, I pulled out my phone and tapped the ride-sharing app to request a vehicle from Marietta to my office in downtown Atlanta. The ride to the city took me 35 minutes, providing me with ample time to reflect on the years of grinding labor required to purchase my BMW. I worked 2 jobs throughout my 20s, saving every cent while my peers were out traveling or buying luxuries. This car was my first major accomplishment, a symbol of the financial independence I had fought so hard to achieve. Because of this, I had always maintained a strict, non-negotiable rule: my vehicle was off-limits to everyone. During my early years in the workforce, Bridget treated my personal space as her own private warehouse. She would frequently snatch the keys off the kitchen counter while I was still asleep or in the shower. This pattern triggered endless confrontations within the Hobbs household. Every time I confronted her, she would laugh it off, dismissively calling me selfish or stingy for not sharing with my own sister. Mom almost always intervened, silencing my complaints by insisting that family members should naturally support one another regardless of personal boundaries. Things escalated several months ago after a particularly egregious incident. Bridget had borrowed the car without asking, returning it with the interior trashed trash stuffed into the door pockets, and my emergency roadside kit missing. The sheer lack of respect for my property was a turning point. I realized that verbal arguments were useless against someone who felt entitled to everything I owned. I spent my weekend researching and installed a high-definition 2-way dashcam system. The device was discreetly mounted to capture both the road ahead and the interior of the cabin. It was a proactive measure intended to keep a record of any future unauthorized usage. This morning's event, however, shattered all my expectations. Bridget had gone far beyond simply grabbing the keys when I was not looking. She had lunged for them while I stood directly in front of her. She ignored my direct verbal protest and executed a hostile, premeditated theft of my property in broad daylight. The blatant arrogance in her eyes as she pulled away signaled that she had lost all remaining sense of shame or fear regarding my boundaries. The Uber driver finally turned into the designated drop-off lane in front of the logistics building in Atlanta. I checked my reflection in the mirror, smoothed my blazer, and gathered my work bag. After paying the fare and offering a curt nod to the driver, I exited the car. I approached the glass revolving doors, swiped my security badge against the sensor, and walked into the lobby. I navigated through the busy hallway, ignoring the casual greetings from my coworkers, and headed straight for my desk. I sat down, opened my laptop, and immersed myself in the complex shipping manifests that required my immediate attention, desperate to lose myself in the structure of my professional life. The rhythmic sound of my keyboard was suddenly interrupted by my desk phone, the screen flashing an unfamiliar number with the local area code of Cobb County. I reached out and clicked the speakerphone button, feeling a slight sense of unease. "Joanna Hobbs speaking," I said, keeping my tone professional. "Good morning, Ms. Hobbs. This is Officer Miller from the Cobb County Police Department. I am calling to verify your registration status." A firm voice replied. "Are you the registered owner of the BMW currently bearing the plate number ending in 842? My heart skipped a beat, but I kept my voice steady. "Yes, that is my car. Is there a problem?" "Ms. Hobbs, your vehicle has been identified at the scene of a major traffic accident in Marietta." The officer stated, his tone becoming increasingly serious. "Due to the nature of the situation, we need you to provide a statement as the primary owner of the vehicle." "I am currently working in Atlanta." I quickly responded, my mind racing as I tried to comprehend what he was implying. "What happened? Can you provide me with some details over the phone? We do not release case specifics through this channel, Ms. Hobbs. You are required to report to the Cobb County Police Station immediately to meet with the investigator assigned to this incident." I stared at my monitor, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on me. "I understand. I am leaving now. I will be there as soon as I can make the drive." I hung up the phone, my hands trembling slightly against the desk. I stood up and walked directly to my manager's office. I explained that I had been summoned by the police regarding a vehicle incident and needed to leave the office immediately. My manager, clearly sensing the urgency in my demeanor, nodded and told me to handle whatever was necessary. I returned to my desk, packed my laptop, notebooks, and keys into my bag, and bypassed the usual end-of-shift protocols. I stepped out of the lobby and into the humid heat of the Atlanta afternoon. Instead of waiting for a ride-share service, I caught the first available taxi stationed at the corner. "Cobb County Police Headquarters, please," I instructed the driver. As the car pulled into the heavy traffic on the interstate, I stared out the window, watching the city skyline fade behind me. My thoughts were a chaotic blur of suspicion. I knew Bridget's pattern of behavior all too well, but the mention of a major accident suggested she had spiraled into something far more dangerous than just joyriding. Every mile closer to Marietta felt like a countdown to an inevitable confrontation. I needed to reach the station, clear my name, and demand to see the proof of what exactly happened with my car that morning. The mystery of her sudden audacity had now transformed into a full-scale legal emergency that I had to navigate with absolute precision to protect my future. Stepping through the heavy glass doors of the Cobb County Police Station, I felt the sharp contrast between the sterile, cold hallway and the rising panic in my chest. I was directed toward a small, dimly lit interrogation room where Detective Sullivan was already waiting. He signaled for me to take a seat across from him. The detective wasted no time with pleasantries. He laid out the timeline of a severe hit-and-run accident that had occurred in a busy intersection in Marietta earlier that morning. According to his report, my BMW had ignored a red light, struck an oncoming vehicle, and caused significant injuries before the driver fled the scene. I sat in silence, my mind churning with the realization of what had actually happened. Sullivan leaned forward, his eyes fixed on my face as he presented a damning piece of information. "Ms. Hobbs, an anonymous caller reached out to emergency services immediately after the crash." Sullivan explained, his voice devoid of warmth. "The individual stated that the registered owner of the vehicle was the one behind the wheel during the incident." My pulse hammered against my temples. I knew exactly who that caller was. "That is a complete lie," I replied, my voice firm despite the situation. "I was in Atlanta at that time. I have proof." Sullivan reached into a manila folder and placed a clear plastic evidence bag on the table between us. Inside lay my leather wallet, its contents slightly disarrayed. "The caller's testimony might be a lie, but physical evidence tells a different story," he countered. We recovered this from your car. It was found tucked deep under the driver's seat. If you were truly in Atlanta, why would your personal belongings be abandoned inside the vehicle at the crime scene? The trap was laid out perfectly. I realized that Mom and Bridget had meticulously orchestrated this scenario. They had not only taken the car, but had intentionally planted my wallet in that specific spot to provide the authorities with a tangible link to my identity, thereby validating their own fabricated narrative of events. They were counting on my panic and the presence of my own ID to make me an easy target for conviction. I took a deep, steadying breath, refusing to show the fear that threatened to overwhelm me. I met Sullivan's gaze with absolute cold composure. "Detective, that wallet was in my possession when I left for work this morning," I said, measuring each word to ensure maximum clarity. "Whoever moved that car planted those items to shift the blame away from themselves. I have a full alibi for my whereabouts during that hour, and I expect you to investigate the real driver, not the victim of this framing." He watched me for a moment, his expression unreadable, as if he were trying to determine whether I was the perpetrator or a desperate woman caught in a web of family malice. I held my ground, knowing that my truth was the only thing preventing me from being arrested for a crime I didn't commit. As Detective Sullivan stepped out of the interrogation room to handle paperwork, the silence was shattered by the relentless vibration of my smartphone sitting on the cold metal table. I unlocked the screen and my stomach turned. The family group chat titled Hobbs Family United was flooded with frantic messages. My aunts, uncles, and cousins were tagging my handle repeatedly each post, an urgent demand for me to take the fall for the hit-and-run incident in Marietta. One of my uncles left a pointed voice message that I played at a low volume. "Joanna, you have a solid career and no dependents." His voice rasped with artificial concern. "Bridget is a mess and can't handle prison time. It is only logical for you to step up and accept the blame to save your sister." Before I could even process his audacity, my phone rang again. It was the attorney who had represented our family in various legal matters for years. I answered, keeping my responses clipped and professional. "I am calling to offer you some counsel, Joanna." The attorney said, his tone oily and persuasive. "I have reviewed the preliminary report, and I strongly suggest you admit to a simple traffic oversight. If you cooperate, I can personally ensure this is treated as a minor civil settlement rather than a criminal investigation." I didn't give him the satisfaction of a debate. I simply hung up the phone. A moment later, a message from Mom popped up on the screen, detached and manipulative. "You owe this to your family, Joanna. Bridget is your blood, and you are in a position to fix this. Do not make things more complicated than they already are by being stubborn." The sheer audacity of their coordination was suffocating. They were not concerned about the victim of the accident or the truth. They were solely focused on preserving their reputation and shielding Bridget from the consequences of her own recklessness. I realized that my own family was functioning as an extension of the trap that Bridget and Mom had set for me. They had clearly spent the last hour working together to break my resolve and force me into a confession that would ruin my life. I took a deep, steadying breath, feeling a wave of clarity wash over me. I reached into my bag, held the power button, and forced the phone to shut down completely. By severing the connection, I felt the immediate dissipation of their collective pressure. I was no longer a daughter or a sister in this room. I was a defendant in a criminal inquiry, and I had to rely strictly on logic, evidence, and the law. I placed the dead phone on the table, leaned back in my chair, and prepared my final arguments for when Sullivan returned. The legal battle had shifted from a family dispute to a confrontation between the truth and an organized deception, and I was ready to dismantle their lies piece by piece. At 11 o'clock sharp, the door creaked open as Detective Sullivan returned to the room, clutching a stack of typed statements and an official-looking document. "We have your formal statement here, Joanna," he said, placing the papers down. "I need you to review these details one final time before we proceed." I didn't reach for the pen. Instead, I pulled my phone from my bag and powered it back on. The screen lit up showing a barrage of notifications, but I bypassed them all to open the ride-sharing application. I tapped through the history logs until I found the time-stamped receipt for my ride from Marietta to the logistics hub in Atlanta. I rotated the screen and pushed it toward him. "I have concrete proof of my whereabouts, detective," I stated firmly. "This is the digital record of my Uber trip. Look at the departure time and the arrival coordinates. They align perfectly with the window of time when the accident occurred." Sullivan glanced at the screen, his expression neutral. "This could suggest you hired a driver, but it doesn't definitively prove who was behind the wheel of your personal vehicle at the collision site." I understood his hesitation, so I didn't stop there. "Call the Human Resources Department at my company in Atlanta right now. My digital security badge logs every entry through the building's revolving doors. The time I walked through those sensors will match the end of this ride log." He listened intently, finally beginning to grasp that I was not merely defending myself, but building a case. I leaned forward, lowering my voice to ensure he caught every word. "Beyond that, you are looking for the driver, and I have the footage. Months ago, I installed a high-definition two-way dashcam system that syncs directly to the cloud. It records not just the road, but the cabin itself." His eyes widened slightly as the implication sank in. "I am officially requesting that you provide me with a formal consent form." I continued, my gaze locked onto his. "I am authorizing you to access the cloud server. You will see exactly who stole my keys, who drove the car, and who was actually responsible for that crash." The detective grabbed a blank consent form from his folder and slid it across the table. I picked up the pen and signed my name with deliberate, steady strokes. As I handed it back to him, his demeanor shifted from cold suspicion to sharp, investigative focus. He stood up abruptly, tucked the signed document into his file, and walked toward the technical unit's office. I watched him go, the weight of the last few hours finally beginning to lift. The truth was no longer just my word against theirs. It was now a digital file being processed by the police, and there was absolutely no way for Bridget or Mom to talk their way out of what the camera had captured. 20 minutes later, Detective Sullivan gestured for me to follow him into his private office. A single computer monitor sat on his desk, displaying a high-resolution playback of the files he had just retrieved from the cloud server. "I have the data extracted, Joanna," he said, his voice dropping to a low, serious register. "Watch the screen." The footage from the dashboard camera was crystal clear. It showed the interior of my BMW in vivid detail. Bridget was behind the wheel, her knuckles white as she gripped the steering wheel, her face twisted in a mask of sheer panic and adrenaline. Mom was visible in the rearview mirror, sitting in the passenger side of the back seat, her eyes darting around as they careened through traffic. The crash was caught from an external angle as well, a violent, jarring impact that silenced the car for a heartbeat before the chaos erupted. The camera had captured more than just the reckless driving. It had caught the cold, calculated intent of my relatives. In the moments immediately following the collision, I heard Mom's voice, sharp and commanding, cutting through the heavy breathing of the driver. "Drive away quickly," she hissed, her tone icy and devoid of empathy for the victim. "And don't forget the wallet. Stuff it under the driver's seat right now so they know who to blame." Sullivan paused the playback and switched to a secondary audio file, one that had just been forwarded from the emergency dispatch archives. He hit the button, and the room filled with the sound of a woman's voice, the same voice I had known my entire life. "The 911 call you received this morning was recorded from this line," Sullivan explained. "It is your mother's voice. She didn't just facilitate a hit and run, she actively provided false testimony to the authorities to frame you." The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The video provided the visual proof of who was operating the vehicle, while the recording proved the premeditation behind the staging of the crime scene. It was a perfect storm of evidence that dismantled their entire narrative. The pieces of the puzzle were no longer fragmented. They formed a singular, damning picture of betrayal and criminal negligence. Sullivan closed the file, his expression grim. He looked at me for a moment, perhaps recognizing the weight of what I was processing before his professional demeanor took over. He reached for the radio handset on his desk. "We have sufficient evidence," he said into the radio, his eyes locked on mine. "The individuals are identified. The units are to proceed with immediate detention procedures for questioning." He set the radio down and looked at the clock, the reality of the situation finally setting in. My family's attempt to destroy my future had inadvertently provided the very evidence needed to ensure their own accountability. I stood up, feeling a strange sense of calm, ready to witness the end of this deception. The midday heat of the Georgia sun was stifling as I stepped out of the interrogation office, but for the first time in years I felt a cooling breeze of relief. As I walked through the main lobby toward the exit, the scene unfolding in the waiting area was impossible to ignore. 2 uniformed officers were standing over Bridget and Mom. Their expressions had shifted from arrogance to sheer terror as the officers read them their rights and informed them they were being taken into custody. They were being formally processed for a series of severe charges: felony hit and run, reckless endangerment, and the deliberate filing of a false police report to frame an innocent party. I watched as they were led toward the secure processing area, their protests silenced by the reality of the handcuffs locking into place behind their backs. I didn't stop. I didn't offer a final word or a lingering look of sympathy. I simply pushed open the heavy front doors, feeling the physical weight of their toxic influence lift with every stride I took toward the parking lot. I left the chaos of the police station behind me, finally detaching myself from the family members who had been more than willing to trade my freedom for their own comfort. I did not drive back to the house in Marietta. Every room in that place was now tainted by the memory of their betrayal. Instead, I drove straight into the heart of downtown Atlanta, pulling into the parking garage of a high-end luxury leasing complex. I signed the lease for a secure high-rise apartment within the hour. It was a blank slate, a fortress of my own making where no one else possessed a spare key or access to my life. That same evening, I sat down with a specialized attorney to draft the paperwork for a permanent protective order. I was ensuring that no one bearing the Hobbs name would ever be able to approach, harass, or interfere with my professional or personal life again. I was cutting the ties completely, choosing my own peace over their dysfunctional demands. The hardest but most vital lesson I learned was that personal boundaries are not optional suggestions. They are the absolute foundation of your survival. If you are constantly lenient with manipulative individuals, they will inevitably interpret your empathy as a character flaw to be exploited. I had spent years pouring my energy into a bottomless pit of familial expectations, only for them to turn around and attempt to ruin my future. Today, that cycle ended. I was no longer a tool for their convenience. I was the architect of my own safety. Thank you for following my journey to this resolution. It took immense courage to stand up to people I had known all my life, but truth is the most powerful weapon you can wield. If you have ever had to set firm, non-negotiable boundaries with manipulative family members, please leave a comment below and share how you reclaimed your agency and peace of mind.